someplace where you feel like you just really don't belong there? That's just not your place. You know, you feel kind of like I don't want to say an outcast, but you just kind of feel like, I don't know, this is just not for me. Anybody ever been there? Like you feel like you just don't belong here. Well, not here. I hope you feel like you belong here. But you just feel like, you know, that wherever you were, I just don't belong, you know? My first year of college, I may have shared some of this with you already because I've kind of lived, I guess, a boring life, and I share the same stories over and over again. So, but my first year of college, I stayed up at home. I'm from the north, and I stayed up home and went to college 1 year up there, and I was miserable. Even though I was at home, I felt like I was totally out of place. It was a bigger school than I needed and that I wanted to go to. It was, and I didn't know anybody there at the campus, and I was just lost. I didn't belong. It was not. I didn't fit in at all. I didn't have any friends there, and I just struggled the whole time. In fact, I may have told you this story also, but I had my first or second semester. I was only there 2 semesters, and then I transferred to Cumberland, into Tennessee. My first or second semester, I had speech class. And I went to NKU, so it was about the size of Tennessee Tech. So it wasn't massive, but it was about, I don't know, at the time, there was around 10,000 students, something like that, which for me was like too big, okay? So I go to speech class, and I guess we sat in like, I guess they had assigned seats. I don't remember why you would do that in college, but anyways, we had assigned seats, I guess. So the very first day of class, the professor, if you've been to college, you know, the professor goes through the syllabus, and then the professor, I don't remember if it was, I blocked it all on my mind. I don't know if it was a female or a male professor, I'm not sure. But they said, okay, now I want you to do, I think it was 2-minute impromptu, just stand up and tell us about yourself. I'm sweating bullets, okay? And there's about 70 or 80 people in the class. It's a full class. And so, anyways, they go through the room, and it gets closer to me, and I'm like, man, I can't do this. There's no way. And listen, I'm not lying about this. This is not even preacher exaggeration at all, okay? The person in front of me stands up and says, whoever they are, I wasn't listening to anybody, you know, I'm just sweating. So they said their 2 minutes or whatever, they sat down, I kid you not, the professor says, okay, that's all the time we have for today, so we'll start right back there on Wednesday. I think it was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. So I left that class. I don't know if I had another class after that. It didn't matter because I skipped it. I went straight to the student center and dropped that class right there. Because I was petrified of sharing who I was for 2 minutes with people that I didn't know. And now look, this is what I do for a living. And you're probably thinking, man, you should have stuck with not speaking, right? I don't know. But anyways, that's how I was. I was so paranoid. I was so petrified of sharing anything in front of anybody. I did not belong there. And so sometimes we just get in that situation where we don't belong, and that's just, sometimes we feel like that's our type, that's how we are wired. Well, if you feel like that, not about speech class, but if you feel like you are sometimes in places where you just don't feel like it's right, you don't feel like you belong, you might be a type 4. The type 4 is an individualist. Now in the book, The Road Back to You, they call the type 4 as a romantic, and I don't know how they connect the two, individualist and a romantic, but anyways, so a type 4, let's go through I think we have those types again. So remember, we've already looked at the reformer, we've talked about the reformer, and the reformer was the type 1 that stood out for others, they mentored others, they would call other people out, and we haven't taken the test yet, that's kind of for you doing it on your own. And we said that the reformer was probably Paul. Paul was, now we don't know because none of the Bible characters that we've looked at, as far as we know, they didn't take the test, right? We don't know if they took the test. But based on what we know from their writings or what is written about them, Paul was more than likely a reformer. Secondly, You can put it back up there, sorry. Secondly was the helper. And so we said the helper was, that's number type 2. They found joy when others prospered. They loved helping other people. But they speak the truth in love. And we said that probably the Apostle John, and my wife Lou Ray, is a 2. She's not a biblical character, but the Apostle John was more than likely because he was a helper. Okay? He took joy in finding that when others would succeed. Type 3 was the achiever. Now the achiever, we said, and in the book he uses a different phrase for a performer, I think, for that. But the achiever is can be deceptive. That's kind of their one of their struggles, a type 3. But they're driven to succeed, and sometimes no matter what the cost is, they're just driven to be successful. They're driven to succeed, and they tend to be people pleasers. And we looked at biblically, the person of Jacob, and Jacob fit into all those categories. And by the way, we also looked at I was a type 3. So not that I'm a biblical character, but we looked at that as well. So tonight is type 4, the individualist. And then next week, we'll go into type 5, the investigator. Anybody like to investigate things? Ashley does. She's pretty excited about it too. Her hand went straight up. 6 is the loyalist. 7 is the enthusiast. 8 is the challenger. I know who's and the peacemaker is number 9. Now, some of us, listen, you may not fit, you may not fit this, if you're a 6, you may not have all those characteristics. You may have some characteristics of other things, and we'll talk some about that as well. And if you know anything about the Enneagram, you know that there is some overlapping, and there's wings and all of that stuff, and we'll get into some of that as well probably. But the key is, here's why we're doing this. We're not doing this so you'll know more about the Enneagram, okay? The Enneagram is a great tool, and I think it's a great tool to use, but we're not having this series on knowing your type just so we can have a better understanding of the Enneagram itself. We're doing this so that you have a better understanding of who God created you to be. Listen, we said from the very first week we read Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. That says, so God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him male and female. God created you in his image. He created you. Now, we're different, right? Male and female, we're different. But we are all created in the image of God. But take it a step further in Psalm 139, he says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So even though we're created in the image of God, we are uniquely different. So it's good to know our type so that we can be all that God has saved us to be, all that he created us to be, but also all that he saved us to be. So it's good to know our strengths and our weaknesses and what sort of things make us who we are. Now remember we said last week, and we mentioned this a couple times, just knowing who you are, knowing your strengths and your weaknesses is not an excuse for poor behavior and sinful behavior. It doesn't excuse, listen, sin is sin, and it doesn't excuse that, and any sin breaks the heart of God. So we can't just say, oh, well, that's just me, that's just how I am, that's just the way I am, I wrote it down this way. We can't just say, well, that's just the way I am, God created me that way. Listen, sin is still sin, and it still breaks the heart of God. It's good to know our weaknesses, yes, but not so we can excuse our behavior. We need to know our weaknesses so we can work on those, and we know what sort of things that we need to give more attention to so that we can be better, show who Christ is better in our lives, and not fall into the weaknesses or the sinful natures that we all have. So knowing your type hopefully will help you tune in to your tendencies, your weakness tendencies that we all have. We all have them. No matter what type you are that was on the screen earlier, no matter what type, we all have some weaknesses. We all have strengths, but we all have weaknesses. It's good to know both so that we can focus on, we can deal with the strengths, but also focus on the weaknesses so we won't fall prey to those weaknesses. We can work on those things. For example, I've told you last week, and I told you now, I'm a type 3. And so I'm an achiever. And one of the things that a 3 supposedly struggles with, and not that all 3s are going to struggle with this, okay? It's not like across the board everybody's going to have these same characteristics, okay? But one of the things that type 3s struggle with is I don't always like helping people out. I know that sounds horrible, right? I mean, I don't always like helping. You know why? Because it like takes time, and so for me it slows me down. Like I had to go. That's terrible. I had to go. I got to go and take care of somebody yesterday in a benevolent situation, and take some things that this person needed. And listen, I was dreading that the whole way. I was, because I had other things to do, and it was going to slow me down. It was going to keep me from doing what I wanted to do. That's horrible. But just because I don't always like helping out other people, and I'm not saying that I'm like some horrible person. I don't want to help you at all. But like mentoring people or whatever, that's just hard to do. It takes time, and I just rather do it myself than teach somebody else how to do it, because it slows me down. But just because I'd rather do it that way doesn't mean it's right. The type 3, the book refers to some deadly sins, that thing that really trips us up. Type 3, you know what mine is? Deception. That'll bless you, right? So I have a tendency to be deceiving. I want you to think that I'm better than I really am. That's a deception about me, and that's wrong. I shouldn't want those things. I shouldn't try to do those things. I'm tempted to deceive others in that way, and in matter of fact, I'm really tempted to deceive myself, thinking that, well, maybe if I portray this, then they're going to think this, and then I'll start believing this about me. That's wrong too. So listen, it doesn't excuse those behaviors, okay? It just helps us, hopefully, knowing those things about us, helps us to become a better person, and not better because God will love us more when we are better, but better in the sense that we will be more of an example of Him to others when we work on those things that kind of continually trip us up, okay? That we continually struggle over and we stumble over. That's what it's all about. So, type 4s. If you are a type 4, you feel deeply, more than likely, and you express your feelings openly. You want to make a huge difference in the world, but you may feel like you're out of place at times, like you just don't belong, if you're a type 4. If you're a type 4, social situations, you don't do very well in those. In fact, in social situations, sometimes in social situations, you choose to hang out in the back until someone else comes and approaches you. This is not wrong. I'm just saying this is some tendencies that type 4s typically have. You probably don't like criticism very much. Not that anybody really likes criticism very much, but you really probably don't like criticism very much. And it's okay for you. Sometimes you just have to go off the grid for a while. You just kind of have to unplug. And all of us kind of have to do that at times, but you just go off the grid sometimes. Nobody knows where you are, and you're good with that. You kind of like just going off the grid. You almost always feel like you lack certain traits that you desperately want and need. There's certain characteristics, there's certain gifts that other people have that you desperately want, and you feel like you need. You're lacking, you feel like. You're lacking these certain gifts that you want. Remember, I told you I'm a type 3, but I have wings of a type 4. So some of these are present in my life, which means which definitely shows why I felt for most of my life, especially as a teenager, that I just didn't really feel like I fit in anywhere. If it wasn't for a certain team that I was on, specifically a baseball team or whatever, if it wasn't that, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere else. I felt kind of out of place. I didn't know how to act in front of other people. And I don't necessarily weird. I had friends, but I never was really myself for other people. I didn't feel like I could be. I didn't even know who that person was. So I had a tendency to go into those types of four tendencies that they have. And sometimes I just felt like I didn't belong. But let me show you who possibly was a type 4. And you may think this is kind of odd that we would look at this person. But David, King David, quite possibly was a type 4. Now let me show you what I mean by that. If you have your scripture, if you have your Bible, turn to 2 Samuel chapter 11. If you don't, it's going to be on the board in just a second. But this is a passage that is very famous. It's a chapter that's very famous. If you haven't been at church at all, you probably have heard of this passage. This is where David has the encounter with Bathsheba. And we're going to look at not the whole chapter, but we're going to skip around a little bit at this chapter and see just what we mean by, okay, maybe this does prove that David had at least, whether he was not a 4 or not, he at least had some tendencies that showed he was an individual person and he was a type 4. Okay? Let me read this for you. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go to battle, David sent Joab. Now that is so key to all of the story. And I'll come back to that in just a second. That one simple phrase. In the spring of the year, when the time when kings go out to battle, who was the king? David. The time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab, who was his commander of his army, instead of himself, and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened, that's key, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, and he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not that this but Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Now, here's what I mean by type 4. David might be a type 4 because type 4s sometimes have a tendency to be idle. And what I mean by that, not idle like I-D-O-L. They don't have idle, but they're idle. In other words, here's what it means. Not working or active, no real worth. Listen, remember what it said in verse 1? He should have been somewhere else. Kings, they were supposed to be out at battle, but David chose not to do that. David chose to stay, and he was idle. He wasn't active. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And listen, when we are in the wrong place at the wrong time, it almost always brings bad news, bad results for us. If we are not where we are supposed to be, it almost always works out not to our benefit, to our detriment. We have to always be aware that we're supposed to be where we're supposed to be at that time. Listen, Proverbs 19 verse 15 says, "Slothfulness or laziness cast into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger." If you are an idle person, if you become lazy, listen, that doesn't lead to anything good. It leads to danger, just like it did in David's life. Proverbs 18:9. I've got a lot of scripture, and I apologize for that, but we're playing Bible Girl. "Whoever is slack in his work is a brother to him who destroys." Listen, if we're not actively pursuing Christ, if we are just idle and we take a step back, listen, we're going to suffer harm. Now, I'm not talking about rest. We need rest. We need to take rest. We need to step away and just kind of step back and rest some. But listen, when we are supposed to be somewhere, David was supposed to be out to battle. When we're supposed to be somewhere, we know we're supposed to be somewhere, and we choose not to go, that's because we're lazy or we're just being idle. And we get into trouble when we do that. Type 4s have a tendency, we all have a tendency, but we type 4s have a tendency to do that. I told you I have the wings of a type 4, which means that I can slide into those tendencies from time to time. When I have days off, usually Fridays is kind of a day off, somewhat, most of the time it is. Here recently I've been doing school work on Fridays, but if I have a day off and I don't have anything to do, I'll sit and watch TV. Now, and usually, and I'll, I don't pray for this, but I hope that there's like SVU marathon on, okay? I don't know why, that's just my, so anyway, so I'll watch that, and before I know it, it's like 5 hours, I'm like, I have done absolutely nothing. I have been lazy, I've been idle, and not that that's necessarily sinful, but listen, I'm not doing anything good. I'm not doing anything productive. I get entranced, and I've seen them hundreds of times, or the same shows over and over and over again. And I know what's going to happen. I can say most of the lines. I know what they're going to say before they ever say them, right? I could be on the show because I know the lines as well as they do. But I still watch them. And that's just being lazy sometimes. And then listen, that's we have to watch ourselves that we don't become idle. And we just sit back and we're not doing what God is calling us to do. Secondly, the type 4 person can sometimes be filled with envy. You see what happens in verse really 2 through 5, but 3 through 5 when it says verse 2, and then it happened. And then in 3 through 5, David sent and inquired about the woman. He sees this woman, right? And he sees her bathing, and so he becomes envious. He's filled with envy. Here's what envy means, which, by the way, type 4, their deadly sin, like type 3 is deception. Type 4, guess what, is envy. That's their deadly sin. If you're a 4, you're an envious person, I guess. I don't know. But, so envy means feeling of discontent or covetousness with regard to another's success or their possessions. You covet what they have, what you want. It's not yours, it's theirs. But you want it. You have lustful desires for something that doesn't belong to you. That's what happened to David. He sees this beautiful woman and he lusts after her, and he has to have her. Proverbs 14:30 says this: a tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Tranquil heart means a peaceful or a calm or a quiet heart. David didn't have that. He had an envious heart. Envy is none of these above. When you have envy in you, you're not peaceful, you're not calm, you're not quiet. You're jealous. And you want, you desire, and it burns inside of you. You desire what you don't have, and in most cases what you don't need. It belongs to somebody else, but you want it. James tells us in chapter 3, verse 16, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. Every vile practice. If jealousy and envy exist, then everything vile will be there. Everything vile will be there. And disorder will be there. Jealousy and envy bring nothing good into your life. So type 4s can tend to be idle and not do anything productive. They can tend to be envious. And then the last thing, type 4s tend to work to protect their identity. Now let me give you a little synopsis here before we read the rest of the story. In verses 6 through 13, you may know what happens. So David finds out she's pregnant. We read that. And so verses 6 through 13, he sends for Uriah, who is Bathsheba's husband. He is out to battle where David is supposed to be. he's out to battle, and are you waving at me? Okay.
I'm sorry.
You're like shaking your head.
I'm sorry.
Am I saying something wrong? Okay. So, anyways, she's going crazy right now. I don't know what she did. But, he's out to battle. David sends for him to come back. And so he will sleep with his wife, Bathsheba. He brings word from the front. He wants word from the war, but he wants him to come. Basically, he wants him to come and have relations with his wife. And so that would mean David's off the hook, right? David then can just be, he's fine. He's off the hook. But Uriah is an honorable man. And he basically chooses, because his fellow soldiers are out fighting the battle and they're not sleeping in their own homes, he's not going to either. And he sleeps outside of his house. And David tries other things to try and get Uriah to go into his house. But he just won't do it. So David has to step up his game. He has to step up his game. He knows that what he's trying so far is not working. So he steps up his game. When we pick it up in verse 14, here's what it says. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab. Remember that Joab is his commander, his leader of the army, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Imagine this. He tells Joab to come and give Uriah this letter. So Uriah is carrying the letter, and we're going to look at what this letter contains in his hand to the front line. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die." Can you imagine? Uriah himself is carrying a letter, his death letter, basically. And David set all of this up. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there would be valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. Uriah carried his own death command with him to the front line. David had to step up his game, and he became he became evil, and so he worked to protect his own identity, no matter what it looked like. It didn't matter to him. He was going to protect his identity at any cost, and that cost was Uriah's life, who was an honorable. We don't want people to really know we don't want people to know who we really are. We want to give a better impression of ourselves. We don't like to be real sometimes. And I'm not saying we should all stand up here in the front and air our dirty laundry. I'm not suggesting that. I don't know if that's beneficial. I don't really think it is. But I do think that we all have to have those groups of people that we trust, that we can do life with, and that we just can share some of our struggles with. We have to have that. If you're not part of a small group where you can do that in a smaller group of people, listen, I highly recommend you. We need that. You need that. We all need that. We need to be able to share those things with people, not so that we can feel better about ourselves, and not so that they can just, get in our grill and tell us how bad we are, but so we can all have come to a better understanding, and we can grow unity together. Let me read you a couple more verses, and then we're done. What is the next verse? Is it Romans? Yeah, Romans 16:18 says this: "For such persons do not serve the Lord Christ, but their own appetites." You see, if a person is envious, if a person is looking out for their own identity instead of somebody else, they're not serving Christ. They're serving their own appetites. And by smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the hearts of the naive. That's not naive, by the way. That's naive. Just in case you're troubled. That's what a person who is struggling to keep their identity intact, to keep what they think people think of them or what they want people to think of them. They're not, if they're doing evil things, they're not serving Christ. They're serving their own appetites. And the last verse, Proverbs 6:18, a heart that devises evil plans, feet that make haste to run to evil. If your heart devises evil plans, feet that will make haste to run to evil. If your heart devises these evil plans, and your feet are going to follow them, you're going to run straight into evil, and you're going to run straight into what in fast. It says, make haste, run into evil. If we're not careful. Now we know the story of David. The rest of the story. He was a man after God's own heart. We know that. And we know that at the end of the story, some of the sin that he committed never left his house, did it? He struggled with that for the rest of his life. But he did rebound. He wrote a lot of the book of Psalms. He wrote a lot of the Psalms, and he wrote Psalm 23. And he wrote some of those Psalms that are just beautiful Psalms, crying out to God. He turned his life back to God. But listen, we still have a tendency, if we're not careful, to fall into the trap of becoming idle if we're not careful. There was things that happened in David's life that didn't need to happen. But because he wasn't focused on seeking God and serving God in those moments, that wasn't on his radar. That wasn't on his, maybe he was just tired. He felt like he'd been battling all of his life and he just needed a break. But that wasn't the right thing for him to do. And neither is it for us. Become idle. That leads us to destruction. Sometimes we get filled with envy. And sometimes our identity or what other people think of us is more important than our own relationship with God. Listen, if that's where you are, then can I just plead with you? It's time that you work on those. Not so that God will love you more, but so that you will become more of what God has created you to be. You'll be the person He's created and saved you to be. You won't even care about what other people think. You'll be more concerned with what God is doing in your life. So let me ask you these last questions as we close. Think for yourself around your table. We can talk around your table if you want, but think for yourself, what causes me to feel like I don't belong? Are you there? Have you been there? We've all maybe have been there at some point in our lives. What causes us at times to feel like we don't belong? Is it a lie from the enemy? Sometimes I think it is. You know about saying I feel like sometimes we give Satan too much credit, and I blame him for all of my poor choices. When the truth of the matter is, I make plenty of poor choices on my own. I don't need Satan's help. I just blame him for everything. But I'm very capable of making my own poor choices. Well, what is it that causes you to feel like you're alone? And the last question is, the next time, make this personal. If you feel like, or I feel like I don't measure up, don't believe it. Don't believe it. You know how this word really becomes useful in our lives. But there's many ways. Maybe that's not the right way to say it. But here's a couple of, let me give you three things. When the enemy attacks, and he will attack. And by enemy, I mean Satan. The enemy attacks. And he tells you that you're not good enough. He tells you you don't have what it takes. He tells you that you're lacking things that you feel like you need and you want and you don't have. Here's what you need to do. You just reject the lie. Because it's a lie from Satan. It's a lie from the pit of hell. And you reject the lie. And then secondly, you replace it with the truth. The truth of God's word that tells you you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You're created in the image of God. Yes, you have different gifts. Yes, you have different talents. Yes, you have different, about all of us, that our makeup is just different. That's okay. It would be boring if we were all the same, right? All of us together with all of our gifts and talents make up the body of Christ. So you reject the lie and you replace it with the truth that tells you are fearfully and wonderfully made to be the person that God created you to be. And then you just repeat the process. You know why? Because Satan doesn't give up. He continually attacks. He continually sends us those thoughts that tell us we're not good enough, we can't measure up. We are lacking in some area in our life. We don't belong. It's just simply not true. And we have to recognize who is telling us those messages and replace it with the truth of God's word. Let me pray.